importance of this event in that it is the launch of what will be a very important major new initiative of the Aspen Institute. This event marks the launching of a new policy program of the Institute that we're calling Cybersecurity and Technology. And obviously a topic that, unless you've been on a desert island the last 6 months, which actually sounds pretty good, you realize will remain on the front pages and at the front of the national debate for some time. And again, seeing some of the reporters in the room today, another sign of the centrality of this issue. In fact, we think that 2016 will likely be remembered as the year in which cybersecurity really broke through the national consciousness, becoming not just a wonky IT issue where we get reminders from our respective IT departments about the importance of our computer security, to something that actually could be a threat to the American way of life. Cybersecurity, it turns out, is central to almost everything we do. It involves the way we bank, we shop, we learn, we travel, and increasingly it will involve and relate to how we drive, how we heat our homes, even how we vote. So protecting digital security is no more just a matter of preserving all the family photos that we have now digitized, but it really is central to the national debate and to so many critical issues. And we've seen over the last few years how much government and business has struggled to keep up with the attacks and new defenses and new attacks and new defenses. And we thought it was enormously important, and this is actually a great personal interest of Walter Isaacson, who's very sorry he couldn't be here today, that it was very essential to add this as a component of the Institute. Our goal with the program is to recognize that while the world is obviously a much better place with a rapid advance of technology, that we need stronger and faster solutions to keep pace with the ever-changing landscape of digital threats. So this program in the months ahead will offer educational resources as well as always with Aspen, a nonpartisan and cross-disciplinary forum for industry and government and media to discuss these challenges and, very importantly, to offer policy solutions. Chairing this program will be today's moderator, a man that I'm sure is familiar to virtually everybody in this room. We couldn't be more pleased that we were able to attract John Carlin to do this. John, who now chairs the Global Risk and Crisis Management practice for the law firm Morrison & Foerster, of course, recently stepped down as Assistant Attorney General for National Security. In that position, the top legal officer in the Justice Department for all aspects of national security. He was responsible for more than 400 lawyers dealing with a wide range of issues across the national security landscape. And of course, that division has been central to so many of the things that we have been reading about over the last 6 months and earlier, whether it was the indictment of 5 Chinese military officials, whether it was Iranian hacking involving a New York power plant, and of course, most recently, the Russian hacks of the DNC. And also, of course, Sony and many other things as well. So John is going to be chair of this program. Garrett Graff, who is here somewhere, is going to be directing that program, with John being primarily at his law firm. And finally, there's so many friends of the Institute here, I want to make clear that this program will naturally overlap with some of our existing programs, and I think will just strengthen all of them. For example, the Homeland Security program, Jane Harmon, who's here, is obviously central to that effort. Also, our Communications and Society program will continue to look at digital issues. Charlie Firestone is here. He heads that program. And finally, of course, the Aspen Strategy Group, headed by Nick Burns, will continue to have this as a critical element of its agenda. But with no further ado, delighted to welcome, not just this morning, but to the Aspen Institute, John Carlin.
Thank you, Elliot. And we'll jump in with a quick introduction of our distinguished guest today. We have with us Lisa Monaco, the President's chief advisor on homeland security matters, everything ranging from terrorism to cybersecurity to pandemics to hurricanes. So it is the true disaster portfolio, and we're glad she had time to appear with us today, and hope she gets a well-deserved break soon. But Lisa's background has been a long-time career public official, ranging from a prosecutor in the District of Columbia, which is where we first met, prosecuting everything from street crime to federal crime, to a member of the Enron task force, to the chief of staff, to FBI director Bob Mueller, to a top official in the Department of Justice's leadership, to the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, and finally to her most recent post. So please
sound
join
familiar?
me. It sounds familiar. I left out the part in my career of having all disasters, which I think may have been wise. But please join me in welcoming Lisa today.
Thank you.
Let's jump right in. We have the president-elect team issuing a statement yesterday that said that, I'm quoting, with modern communications and technology moving with unparalleled speed, that the necessary defenses against that threat have lagged. And that's why for the incoming administration, it needs immediate attention and input from the private sector to make the United States more secure. And they made that announcement in the context of announcing that Rudy Giuliani will be leading a team advising the president. I think you'll be the first administration official to comment on that statement. Let's know your thoughts.
So that statement, that description of the problem that you read, I completely agree. And in fact, it overlaps, I think, I was hearing echoes of it in the description of the program that you're about to chair. So I think the recognition of the fact that this needs to continue, and I say continue to be the top priority for the next administration, is something I welcome, absolutely welcome. The evolution of the threat across threat actors, across threat vectors, across tactics, techniques, and procedures has expanded so exponentially that the defenses have indeed lagged behind. We've made tremendous progress in this administration and have set up a framework. There is absolutely more to do, and I welcome the statement from the transition team that they are going to give this issue the attention that it deserves.
When we, early back when doing the transition from the prior administration, the Bush administration, to the Obama administration, at that point in time, there had been a drive to create a comprehensive cyber initiative. And are there any lessons learned from the attempts to adopt that initiative to the new administration that you could pass on to the next administration to make sure they keep focus on this issue?
So I think there's a few things. The need for, one, prioritization, which we just talked about. When President Obama came into office in 2009, I think he was the first president and there was the first administration to acknowledge that cybersecurity and the cyber threat is one of the greatest national security and economic security threats that we face. I hope the new team keeps that frame as well. Treating these two things as integrated, I think, is extremely important. Having, the prioritization and putting the resources and the attention to it. And doing so across the cabinet. One of the legacies, I think, of this administration will be that in every cabinet engagement the president had on a quarterly basis with his cabinet level, the secretaries of each cabinet level department, cybersecurity was the top of the agenda. And it was precisely so that secretary, that administrator, did not think of cybersecurity as just the IT guy's problem. That he or she recognized the enterprise risk that cybersecurity poses to that cabinet, just like it poses to the CEO of every company in this nation. So prioritization and then recognizing that it needs C-suite level attention, and that has got to be driven down through the organization, are two critical things.
That's so it's a great point that those in government and those who are expert in cybersecurity have spent a long time trying to get the C-suite to think about this issue and make sure it's an area of risk where people who are not cyber experts are in charge of it and responsible, because they're the ones that know what the value is. Could you share with us a little bit, because you reminded me of a story. After OPM, I remember that there were a few meetings that were meant to be convened at a principal or secretary, cabinet secretary level, and there was a little bit of difficulty in getting cabinet secretaries to show up instead of sending their chief cyber experts. Could you tell us a little bit that story, how you were able to corral them, and what the lesson could be for private sector?
So you're right. Oftentimes we would try and bring departments and agencies together to address an issue like OPM or other cybersecurity issues, and the reluctance of those at the senior-most level to really grapple with this issue was quite evident. So it took Dennis McDonough and I convening the cabinet to say, this is top priority. It better be your top priority, or you're going to see your agency, your department be at tremendous risk. And that was borne out in what we saw in OPM.
And I'm remembering, I hope this isn't a state secret, which I don't think it is, but that email was rather sternly phrased and essentially ordered people to come, and that said cyber's your responsibility. It's one of the only times I can remember that blunt email in a meeting notice.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about, because you had such a diverse portfolio, but I've heard you think before, and I know Ben Wittes wrote an interesting book about Gabrielle Blum about what the healthcare pandemic threats, terrorism threats, and cybersecurity and cyber threats have in common.
Yeah. Well, it is. It's something that I have become intimately involved in this role, as you pointed out. I think the thread that goes through all of those is the transregional nature, the borderless nature of those threats. And you cannot create or erect an artificial domestic and international divide when addressing those. You need a whole of government approach. You have to apply every single tool, every instrument of national power that we have as a government to address every single one of those issues. You know, one of the things I found, it's obviously transition time, and I've been reflecting on what's going to be useful to my successor, what was useful to me in coming into this job, and having now spent 20 plus years in government, I've seen a number of transitions from a number of different angles. And what I'm struck by is this evolution of the threats that we face, and those that float to the very top of the agenda for somebody in my job. And when I think back of prior transitions, in the Clinton transition from President Bush to President Clinton, obviously terrorism was front of mind. In the Obama to Bush, the Bush to Obama transition, terrorism and cyber were exceptionally front of mind, and I already referenced what President Obama did in 2009 to elevate the priority for cybersecurity. What I am talking to my successor about is absolutely terrorism threats, absolutely cybersecurity, we've just talked about that, but I am also making the point that emerging infectious diseases are the threat that I think this new team will face in the way that we, and in the prior administration, encountered both terrorism and cyber threats. So I view emerging infectious diseases as almost the cyber of this administration's transition, in addition to, obviously, cybersecurity.
So I think you mentioned there, have you met the President-elect has named Tom Bossert as his Homeland Security advisor, someone we've both worked with in the Bush administration. Have you two met?
Yes, absolutely. We've sat down a number of times, and we'll do so right up until January 20th. And I, as I've said to him, will be as helpful as I can be going forward. As I should note, my predecessors in this job, from Fran Townsend to Ken Weinstein to obviously John Brennan, have been exceptionally helpful to me as I've been tried to carry out these duties. So Tom is, as you noted, he served as deputy to this position at the end of the Bush administration, and we've had a number of very good conversations and are working through the long list, my very long national security and homeland security to-do list.
Do you know, there's been some talk in the prior administration, there were two separate councils, a National Security Council and a Homeland Security Council, and your position chaired the Homeland Security Council. Under the Obama administration, it's been one National Security Council with dual-hatted leadership, a National Security Advisor and a Homeland Advisor. Talking with Tom Bosser, do you know what the structure will be for the president-elect?
I don't. I think they're still working through that. But what I think is critically important, and what that has been signaled in the naming of Tom as the Assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, my same role, what I think is critically important is that this role, and it's something that I have benefited from tremendously in doing my job, this role has to have two things. One, direct and immediate access to the President. I have had it. I've got about 50 paces from my office door to the Oval Office that I use far too often, I suspect the President would say, because it's always about some disaster, some issue, some problem when I'm coming to see him. And in addition to meeting with him every morning as part of the national security and the President's daily brief. So direct and immediate access to the President, and clear leadership and accountability and resources to drive the policy process on homeland security and counterterrorism issues, which is what I have had, and the ability to clearly convene both deputies and principals of the cabinet agencies on those issues. So, case in point, I will convene deputies meetings on counterterrorism policy issues that span the globe, quite literally span the globe. And on homeland security issues, I convene the cabinet, as I did in the afternoon of the Boston Marathon bombings, 3 weeks into the job, I might add. I convened the principals on that apparently homeland security issue at the time, although we didn't know quite what we had at the time. So having direct and immediate access to the President and the accountability and resources to drive the policy process, those are the two ingredients, and I'm hopeful they'll continue that. I also think integrating the National Security Council staff, as this administration has done, has proved to be a critical element of what I've been able to do. In other words, these threats that we're talking about, they don't have a divide. You cannot divide what is a solely domestic threat and what is solely an international issue. They cross. And so integrating the staff reflects that, and I think is pretty important in order to get good policy options and recommendations to the President.
And let's talk about some of those cross-border nature, particularly the cyber threat. It's been a hallmark of a change in approach in this administration, really starting in 2014 with the indictment of the 5 members of the People's Liberation Army, to try to impose costs or consequences even on nation-state actors who commit cyber intrusions inside the United States. And whenever you do an action that causes pain to an adversary, it's obviously can raise issues in the foreign policy wings, and there can be a tension between the National Security Council type perspective and the Homeland Security type of approach. And whether it's taking action against China for cyber intrusions, against Iranian actors, it always implicates a host of other foreign policy, and most recently Russia, which I'll turn to a little bit more. But could you walk through with us a little bit, what are the factors that would lead you to take action even though it will cause a reaction from the foreign power, and what's the debate like as you try to free up the use of some of these tools?
So the conversation, one, you have to make sure happens. So that's the first thing. You have to make sure you're bringing those issues into the room, and it's usually the Situation Room, to have all of those voices heard. So a number of the factors, I guess what I would say is there's principles that we try to apply. One is that all the tools that we have are going to be on the table. So in other words, a cyber action taken by an adversary does not necessarily have to be met only with a cyber response. That ought to be a tool on the table. But let's look at all the tools we have. So as you noted, law enforcement tools, intelligence, military, sanctions, financial tools, diplomacy, both public and private messaging. So a whole host of tools, all of them need to be on the table. And we need to make sure we're bringing those, and importantly, developing options to give to the president across all of those domains. And you know, the question is, what are the considerations? Well, they're going to be the foreign policy considerations of what will be the reaction, what is in the long-term national interest for the United States vis-a-vis our relationship with, if it's a nation state we're talking about, what is the potential for escalation, right? Do you want to make sure that we are not going into an escalatory cycle that isn't ultimately in our national interest? We want to make sure that the retaliation that we could face, just take on in the cyber realm, we are far more connected and reliant on the internet than, say, I don't know, North Korea. And what is that action-reaction cycle? All of those things need to go into the mix. And our guidepost has to be, one, willingness to impose consequences, and I think we've shown that this administration has shown we are willing and indeed believe there needs to be consequences for a whole set of malicious cyber activity. We need to deploy all tools and have all tools on the table in order to enforce those consequences. And we need to make sure that in doing so, our guidepost is our national security interests over the long term.
And let's talk about the development of some of those tools, because I know a frustration for you in your spot when it came to deterring cyber behavior, unlike terrorism, unlike those who proliferate weapons of mass destruction, there wasn't a full range of deterrent tools on the books already. And when we did the Sony case, I remember sitting around the Situation Room table with you, and we were lucky in some respects that it was a rogue nation state because we were able to sanction them. And that thought and the fact that might not be available if it was somebody else led to a new executive order that would allow you to sanction individuals for cyber behavior. Now I see Stuart Baker here today, and I know he had taken to calling it the April Fool's executive order because it was
catchy.
passed. It was catchy. It's passed. It was signed April 1st of 2015, and until December 29th of this year, it had never been used. It's also true when it was first passed, there was a lot of discussion of using it against those who would steal economic information or intellectual property, and it has not yet been used for that part of, and in fact it required a change in the executive order for some of the sanctions that were used on December 29th. So, knowing that you are always completely open about your thinking, do you think it should have been used earlier?
Look, I think that it was excellent advice from John Negroponte, as usual. Look, I think it's incredibly important to have that tool in the toolbox. It is an executive order. I hope that the new team keeps it in place. Because as we saw in our response, as you noted, to the Sony attack, that we had a sanctions tool to use in the counterproliferation realm, but that might not have been the case in with respect to other actors. So very important to have the tool, as you and I discussed at the time. Adding that as an arrow in our quiver is critical. I think there's a lot to be said for having the messaging out there, bringing our international partners and allies along in recognizing the need for this tool. I will say, it wasn't always the case that everyone believes that or has unanimity of view, I should say, in terms of what the standards should be on imposing sanctions for malicious cyber activity. We have the bar pretty high. I think that's a good thing. But having that out there as a signal to not just the malicious cyber actors, but other nation states as well, as to where we're trying to set the bar, where we're trying to set the international norms, is important. And then using that as also somewhat of a deterrent in the messaging about the threat to use it. You mentioned China. We have made quite clear throughout this administration our view that nation states should not be stealing our intellectual property for the purposes of their own commercial gain. We have messaged that right up to the highest levels in every engagement the president has with President Xi. That has been a very important part of our discussions with China. The threat of those sanctions, one could argue, is what brought them to the table when, in September of 2015, President Xi and President Obama announced a set of agreements on malicious cyber activity, and frankly, raised and advanced the ball on international cyber norms. If you have the Chinese president standing in the Rose Garden signing up to a set of norms to include IP theft, then that is, I think, a significant step. And we have seen a reduction and a diminishment in the Chinese activity of which we're concerned about. What I would say is we have to continue to be very clear our intolerance for that type of malicious cyber activity, that there will be costs, and that we are willing to impose them, and that we're going to continue to make that a point of discussion with every nation state and other actors that we think are abusing the cyber realm.
And let me follow up on the executive order, because you talked about a high standard for the use of the executive order on sanctions. And I want to tease that out a little bit, because there's a legal predicate. What could you do under the law to use the executive order? And then there's a policy decision. We've met the legal threshold. Are we going to use the executive order? As we go in to a transition, do you believe there are instances where you could meet the legal predicate on the executive order, and it'll be up to the new team as a policy matter as to whether or not to use it? And if you do, what are the type of factors you think they should consider when making that policy?
So there inevitably will be instances where you can meet the legal threshold, and then you'll have the policy discussion, as we have had, as to whether or not to also impose sanctions. I would say the same is true in the terrorism realm, which has been part of our experience. You may be able to meet the legal threshold for indicting a terrorist actor, but then you have a question about whether or not you also impose the sanctions. The types of factors ought to be, is it going to advance our national interest? Is it going to create a productive area of discussion, whether it's, if we're talking about a nation state, is it going to drive a reaction that is going to be counterproductive? Even if we think, and there's no such thing as perfect information in this regard, even if we think it might prompt a reaction, is that worthwhile in order to send the signal not only to the malicious cyber actor that whose activity you're trying to address, but to the other malicious cyber actors out there? So I think those are the kinds of debates that the next team will have, as we have had, and that's important. But if you don't have the tool in the first place to prompt that debate, then you're not even going to get it out literally onto the table.
And let me follow up on that a little bit with, so I remember there's two different ways to think about it, and it's not so clear that it'll always be one or the other. But what are your views on? There are some who view each deterrence action in cyber, when it's a nation state, whether it's North Korea, Iran, China, or now Russia, in the lens of, will our response affect the behavior of this one country? How will it affect our bilateral relationship? And then there was another school, I'll call it more the homeland security type way of thinking, which would say you need to do it with each actor, even if it may not be effective in this case, because you're trying to set a norm or a rule the same way you would in any other violation of criminal law. What are your thoughts on the tensions between those two ways of looking at it?
Look, I do think that there is a tendency, or there can be a tendency, to look at everything through the lens of what is going to be the consequence for the bilateral relationship. And we shouldn't minimize those discussions. We need to air those and get those out on the table. But when we are talking about setting norms, and this is something that I think we've advanced the discussion on this, both in this country and, most importantly, internationally, since we have raised and advanced cyber norms in every multilateral forum in which we as a nation participate. If you're talking about setting norms, then you have to, show that you're willing to impose consequences, because otherwise, the only incentive here is the potential to isolate bad actors, whether it's in the counterproliferation realm or the terrorism realm or now in the cyber realm. So yes, you have to show that there will be that isolation, and then you start creating the discussion in the adversary's capitals. In other words, is it worth us deploying our standard tool set, our standard malicious cyber activity tool set, or are we more worried about what follows from that in terms of our isolation, whether it's financial, whether it's in the international domain. So I think it is critical to not have these discussions, when we're talking about cyber sanctions, get swallowed up in solely the bilateral relationship lens. It's an important factor, and you got to get that out on the table. But that's why the Situation Room table has many, many chairs.
When it comes to theft of trade secrets and intellectual property, you said something earlier about this administration treating economic security as a matter of national security. And in fact, the statute that was used to pass the executive order required you to run a process where the president said exactly that, that we're facing a national security emergency because of economic espionage. The president-elect has talked about changing an approach towards China, and in particular has focused on this set of issues. Talk to me a little bit, if this is a national security issue, does that mean that the Committee on Foreign Investment inside the United States could consider as a national security matter theft of intellectual property and economic espionage?
In the context of a particular transaction?
Yes. Now that this President Obama has already declared that there is an emergency situation, what role should it play when considering whether or not a transaction affects our national security?
I think we've got to factor that in, because to do otherwise would be to put blinders on as to the evolution and the extremely rapid evolution of technology and what it means for our entire supply chain, right? Which is often the subject of CFIUS transactions, as you know well. So we cannot be looking at these types of transactions that may have an impact on our cybersecurity, on our communications security, in a realm that doesn't account for the evolution of the threat. That wouldn't make any sense. The CFIUS process needs to advance along with the rest of it.
And moving back, same theme, but to the executive order, does the president-elect and his team, do they have a loaded gun? Are there sanctions where the legal predicate has been met, which they could start to impose from day one if they made the policy choice?
I think that there are a number of tools that I would put in that same space. And absolutely, the cybersecurity executive order is in some sense a loaded gun, and it's one that needs to be, I would argue, kept in place, looked at as a critical tool in the arsenal that we have to combat the expanding cyber threat.
There's been discussion, you've talked about using cyber as a deterrent tool against cyber, and why in some instances you would not. What are your thoughts on when you would, and when you would do so publicly?
So, that's obviously a complicated question, because depending on what the tools are, what the adversary is that you're going against, you want to retain the capability of the president. I'm a firm believer that you don't want to take tools off the president's plate when you're talking either covert or overt action. And so the danger in setting up a regime in which you are constantly talking about every cyber action that you're taking is that you diminish or take away some of the president's options in using some other tools. Again, I come back to the first principles. We got to ensure that we are not self-regulating off the table certain tools. So cyber needs to be amongst them, along with the rest of our instruments of national power. And we've got to be have our eye on the long game. What is going to be in our long-term national interest? So cyber operations need to continue to be part of the tool set. Frankly, we have to do more and get better at developing those options and developing them quickly and being nimble about it and being able to serve them up to the president to make some decisions.
I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up to questions from the audience. You talked about needing to be to continue to get quicker and more nimble. Given that the threat right now outstrips our ability to defend it when it comes to cybersecurity threats, given how fast the technology has moved, what are your top three, say, recommendations to the new team? If you view us in a race against time, against a threat that's bigger than our ability to defend, what are the top three things they should be focused on to improve our ability to respond?
So a number of these things were covered in the report of the President's Commission on cybersecurity that was presented to the President December 1st, and that he commissioned last February, precisely because the threat is outstripping our defenses, and we need to make sure that we are doing everything we can to position ourselves to get ahead of it. And so he commissioned a bipartisan group to present recommendations not only to him, but specifically for the new team. So a number of those things are, I would argue, continuing the application of something we have tried very hard to do, which is taking some of the lessons that we have learned in the counterterrorism space and applying them to how we are fighting the cyber threat. We've taken a number of those steps, both structurally, legally, putting new tools in place like sanctions, putting in place things like the Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center, the kind of cyber answer to NCTC, one place in our government, which heretofore had not existed, where cyber threat intelligence comes together and gets integrated and then gets presented every morning to me, to the president, so that we can enable policymakers to know how are we viewing the threat, and that informs what choices we make to combat it. So continuing that approach of applying the counterterrorism tools to the cyber threat so that we can ensure that we are as nimble and as prepared as possible. One of the other recommendations out of the Commission report is doing a lot more work with the private sector to switch our orientation to one of secure by design. This is an issue, particularly as we confront the Internet of Things, which is basically expanding the attack surface for the multiplicity of malicious cyber actors out there, and is going to make us more vulnerable. So we've got to change the orientation, and this has got to come from the private sector, where we are across the supply chain, hardware, software, you name it, to one of secure by design rather than this constant, after the fact patching approach. So these types of things are things that the new team has got to really attack head-on very, very quickly in the new administration, because while we have made tremendous progress, given the expansion of the threat, we are not where we need to be.
Yes, Jane. I think they're bringing you a mic.
Thank you both for your exceptional service. I'm Jane Harmon, and in addition to heading the Wilson Center, I co-chair an Aspen group with Mike Chertoff that advises the Homeland Secretary on issues. And in that connection, we met earlier this week and discussed the vulnerability of voting machines and voting systems. There are ace reporters in this room, and I think it was underreported that last week, I believe, the Homeland Department you designated voting systems, not just machines, but databases, as critical infrastructure. I'm not sure every state loved that, because they think it's their right under our Constitution to regulate the time and manner of elections. But what are the implications of that? And what are the implications of the fact that, so far as I know, most or maybe all voting machines in this country are older than the earliest version of cell phones that any sane person would use?
Well, Jane, thank you for your service, and thank you very much for that question, because I think I'm really glad that you brought that up. Last week, you're right, Jay Johnson designated and informed through the outreach that he's done tremendous outreach on this issue, electoral infrastructure across the country as part of critical infrastructure. He did that pursuant to a process that's laid out in the executive order after consultation with me, and more importantly, after consultation with state and local secretaries of state who themselves administer and organize and manage the voting process. What's really important about this designation is to understand both what it is, what it does, and what it does not do. What it does not do is put the federal government in any way, shape, or form in any oversight or directing capacity for the election process. In our democracy, elections are run at the state and local level as they should be, and this does not change that one bit, any more than the designation of the electric grid as critical infrastructure puts the federal government in any management role for the electricity infrastructure, which is 85% in private hands. So it doesn't change the relationship. What it does do is prioritize the sharing of certain critical information from the federal government, from intelligence that we integrate into the CTIC that I mentioned earlier, and pushing that out to critical infrastructure across the board, whether it's water, power, now the election infrastructure. It also puts election infrastructure in that same category that we talk about in the international cyber norms that I referenced earlier. In other words, one of the critical norms that we have garnered international support for is that no nation state will attack another country's critical infrastructure in peacetime. Pretty important norm to make sure that everybody is on board with. I would argue, particularly in what we've seen over the last several months, that we want to be clear that our electoral process is part of that infrastructure that we condemn, hopefully on a bipartisan basis, any foreign intervention into. So I think Jay's excellent outreach to state and local officials about what this does and what it doesn't do is really important, and I hope it is something that will improve our ability to aid state and local governments, as we did over the summer in preparation for this year's election, to raise their collective cyber defenses as we all need to do.
Do one quick follow-up, because there was something in Jane's question there, which was the age of some of the voting systems, and whether it was the ability of Ukraine to recover from the attack on their electric grid, and their ability to respond so quickly was in part because it was 30-year-old technology that they still knew how to work with their hands, or the attack on the Bowman Dam in Rye, New York by the Iranians, where it wouldn't have worked as designed, not because of a cyber flaw, but because it was down
Yep.
for maintenance at the time.
Yep.
All the way, when it comes to information, to the president-elect saying he doesn't use email. Are there some things that where the best risk mitigation strategy is not modernizing, not connecting to the internet?
Well, it's an interesting twist on cybersecurity, but sure, that's true. And one of the things I firmly believe, and a number of us talked about it in the lead up to the election, makes our voting infrastructure so resilient and insulated, one can argue, from cyber attack, is the fact that the voting machines themselves are not, by and large, hooked up to the grid. However, voting databases are obviously a critical element of making sure that our democratic process is run with integrity, that our voting system and our voting process happens, and that everyone is able to have their voices heard in the election. Those, by and large, are hooked up to the grid and oftentimes not protected, not encrypted, as we found in our discussions with state and local officials. So in one sense, the incredible diffuse nature and the centralized nature of the voting machines themselves and the voting process is an insulation against and is a guard against malicious cyber activity. We've got to look across all elements of the voting process to understand what can be the impact.
Hi, thank you. Mark Rotenberg with the Electronic Privacy Information Center. I want to thank you both Lisa and John for your willingness to meet with privacy groups and technology experts over the last few years. We think this is a very important dialogue. In fact, during the past year, we launched a national campaign in support of data protection, in part in anticipation that cybersecurity would become a growing public policy issue, but also partly out of concern that much of the debate, as you know, is largely between government and the private sector. And the data that's oftentimes at issue is actually the data of American consumers, American voters, American citizens, federal employees. And my question to you is, how do we ensure going forward with the new administration that as they think about cybersecurity, it is not solely a dialogue between government and private sector, but represents the interests of the people and independent technology experts?
I think that one of the ways is to, as I said at the beginning, make sure that we are prioritizing cybersecurity as an economic security matter. So that means accounting for consumer concerns about cybersecurity. In other words, not solely looking at it from the standpoint of what are the state secrets that we need to protect, but what about your credit card data, et cetera. And so we've done a number of things in terms of the consumer privacy realm, putting just the messaging and the signaling of putting that into the cybersecurity bucket as a government, I think is very important. We held the Cybersecurity Summit out in Stanford in 2015, and it was entirely about consumer protection, consumer privacy, and the implications of the cyber threat on that. So prioritizing it not solely as a traditional national security matter, but rather putting it across the board in the as a priority for economic security, I think is a pretty important signal to send. And then, groups like yours continuing to push the government to have this discussion is going to be critically important going forward.
And David Sanger, I know you had a question. While you're moving, I'm going to put in a plug for the new Aspen Institute program on cybersecurity and technology because, Mark, it's designed for exactly that, to provide a space, knowing how much this affects the private sector, for the private sector, government officials, institutions from academia, and those who've been concerned with civil liberties, to have a space to have a constructive dialogue over what is going to be an enormous challenge. David?
Thanks very much, and thank you both for this discussion. And Lisa, thanks for putting up with our many questions over many years here now. 2 points that come out of the conversation with John, I was wondering if you would just go a little further on. You talked about the need for a nimble response. And yet I think when you look at what's been written so far in the Times and elsewhere about the Russia hack, nimble would not necessarily be the first word that would come to mind. The FBI first got onto this in the fall of 2015, and you've read the stories about how long it took the DNC to respond, how long it took the FBI to escalate the issue, and so forth. So I'm wondering if you could just sort of give us, and I'm sure after a number of months of detox from this job, you'll probably have more thoughts about this, but give us a sense of what you think went wrong in the response part there, why the time lag was so great, and whether or not there are things that in retrospect you wish you had done earlier. And on the norm setting that you described it on the defense side, but this administration's always had sort of a hard time discussing cyber offense and the norm setting that comes out of that. And when we travel outside the United States, people always say, well, you're using cyber against ISIS, as the president has said. I've read about other offensive activities the United States is engaged in. And so I'm wondering whether or not you think that needed a more public dialogue so that people had a sense that the United States itself was putting limits on its own use.
Two very good questions. On the latter, look, I think that what we're experiencing with cyber is not unlike the evolution we've had on the counterterrorism realm, right? We've developed a whole set of tools that we have, over time, been more transparent about in the counterterrorism realm. And obviously, this President Obama, has been very clear about the importance of having a legal and policy framework that is laid down and that is one that enables a repeatable process that we can discuss with our allies, with our partners, that we can use to great effect against counterterrorism, against terrorism threats. And we have also, he's made very clear the importance of being increasingly transparent about that. Why do I dwell on the counterterrorism analogy here? Because the same tension exists in the sense of it is important to be transparent for the legitimacy of our actions in the counterterrorism realm, as I would argue in the cyber realm. But in the same, with respect to both challenges, we face the balance that we have to strike between being transparent about our actions and enabling our adversaries to counter those actions. So I think we're going to continue to confront that tension. I think it's important to continue to press, as I know you will do, David, for my successors and others. But we're developing a framework, we're developing a tool set, we're developing kind of a set of repeatable processes in the cyber realm that I think is very important. And so I'm going to link to the first part of your question on nimbleness. Just as we've done in the counterterrorism realm, we've gotten better and more nimble in our operations, whether they're kinetic, whether they're intelligence, whether they're law enforcement. Look, there was a day in the not too distant past when the notion of integrating our intelligence operations into our law enforcement actions was unheard of, or certainly a lot more creaky process, if you will, and a lot more difficult of a process than it is today. And that's because we have set up the structures, put people sitting side by side, and pushed to integrate those operations and to bring those options forward for policymakers. So we've got to do the same thing in the cyber realm. We've got to push to have repeatable processes, a framework that I would argue we applied in the cyber realm. We applied that same framework in the case of the Russia hacking of our election process that we did with respect to China, Iran, and North Korea, which is to say, put all of our intelligence and information together, coming from law enforcement, coming from the intelligence community, coming importantly in the cyber realm from the private sector. Get all that information, put it together, have the intelligence community tell us what it is that we can say about that malicious cyber activity that is going to be in our national interest. In other words, it is not, by saying so, by calling out this activity and by documenting it and proving the case, so to speak, we are not going to hinder our ability through the disclosure of sources and methods to use those same tools in the future, and then call out that activity, as we did with respect to Iran in the Bowman Dam case, with respect to Russia, with respect to China and North Korea, and make clear you're going to impose consequences. Will there always be discussions and critiques about whether we should have acted sooner, whether we should have done other things in addition to the costs that we impose? Absolutely there will be. And that's good. We ought to continue to have that dialogue, and we have to make sure we're continuing to try and strike the balance of imposing costs and doing so in a way that is going to be in our long-term national security interest.
We have a whole row. Michael, Stewart, Ellen, what do you do? And then we'll go back to...
Thank you. Mike Isikoff with Yahoo News. On the tension that John was asking you about in decisions to impose costs, I want to ask you some specific questions about the December 29th sanctions, which some have said was not sufficiently robust given the provocation. You sanctioned the FSB and the GRU as entities, and you sanctioned, I think, 4 top GRU officials, none of whom actually come to the United States, none of them have assets in the United States. But there was a very senior Russian intelligence official who you did not sanction, Alexander Bortnikov, the head of the FSB, longtime associate of Putin. And he is somebody who comes to the United States. In fact, you had invited him to the White House Countering Violent Extremism Summit in 2015, post-Crimea, post-Ukraine. Can you give us just some insight into why you would, if you really wanted to send a message to Putin, you would not have put Bortnikov on the list, and also the thinking about having invited him to that summit in 2015, and in retrospect, did you send the wrong signal?
So it won't surprise you, Michael, or the rest of the reporters in the room. I'm not going to talk about what specific considerations went into the sanctions decisions we made or that might be made in the future. What I would say is there's always a tension, though, in, and it's been prevalent in our entire discussion, of imposing sanctions, and particularly when we're talking about nation states, and also keeping open, doing so in a way that keeps open enough dialogue with that country or those actors that is going to be in our national interest. So we need to continue to have dialogue with a whole host of nation states that we have many issues with when it comes to counterterrorism cooperation, right? Our intelligence agencies need to share critical information about threats against us sharing information about threats against them, because that's in our national security interests. So how do we ensure that we're able to do that and not act against our national security interest in one respect while imposing costs? And those are the kinds of discussions we're constantly needing to have.
Stuart Baker, I do want to thank you, not just for your service, but for your good humor in the face of criticism. One of the things we're seeing with foreign governments using the kinds of exploits that are now possible is increasing creativity. The Russians and the Chinese were probably in our campaign infrastructures in 2008, 2012. It wasn't until 2016 that they got the idea of doxing the candidates. I am struck by the fact that in the last 3 months we have seen numerous reports about really serious cybersecurity failings involving cardiac implants, and that raises the possibility that the next hack doesn't put people's risotto recipes at risk or even their jobs, but their lives. And the ways in which foreign governments could use that against influential Americans are pretty obvious. My question for you is, what would you suggest the next administration do to think about this threat?
So this is really it's the Internet of Things issue that I mentioned earlier. This is where the threat is going. I would argue this is where the threat is now. And so recognizing that, first and foremost, applying the prioritization and the focus and resources to that, as I would argue we have done, and continuing that is going to be absolutely critical. And then I come back to the security by design point. I mean, this is inherently the tension between our interest in expanding commerce and innovation, et cetera, but putting protections and building in to the technology at the front end, security, and considering security at the front end is going to be a challenge, I think, across the commercial sector, across our innovation landscape in the United States, to ensure that our companies are both protected and continue to be competitive. That's a tension that's going to continue into the future.
After Ellen, we'll have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa and John, for doing this and for both of your work in really trying to normalize cyber as part of the national security debate and to bring it to the larger public. Lisa, thank you for speaking at the Washington Post, for instance, to help our audience understand this. So you've kind of expressed how you aren't going to really say whether or not you think you could have acted sooner in perhaps punishing Russia for its actions, but there's also the debate now ongoing about whether your actions were in fact aggressive or strong enough. Some critics say that, in fact, they were pebbles and they want to throw rocks. Your actions could be stronger. Can you talk a little bit more about how and why you didn't take anything stronger and how that might? Do you think it might have, in fact, adverse effects, or do you think maybe a stronger reaction might have the effect you want, both in sending a message to the larger global community about norms, as well as changing Russia's behavior?
So let me return to this question about should we have acted sooner, or should it have been stronger? I would question the premise of both, but I would also, as I do, I would acknowledge that this is an absolutely important discussion to have. I understand that criticism. I think it's healthy. I think it's an important one that we need to engage in. Why? Because these are areas that are going to continue to require us to balance. On the question of sooner, we took a number of steps over the summer, well before the October 7th statement and before the December 29th sanctions, including in messaging directly to President Putin and across other levels of government about this activity. We took a number of steps and prioritized, quite frankly, providing assistance to the 50 states who are going to be engaging in the election process, because our top priority at the time was ensuring the integrity of the election. We pushed out a level of assistance that I think was unprecedented by the Department of Homeland Security to 48 of the 50 states who agreed to take us up on our offer of assistance. I think that in and of itself set a very important baseline of how we can go about providing assistance to state and local electoral infrastructure holders. So we took a number of steps, and then October 7th, with the unprecedented statement of the DNI and the Secretary of Homeland Security about Russian government-directed intrusion into our election system. And then the discussion of the sanctions and other steps that we took to impose consequences and impose costs against Russia on December 29th. There will be, I think, legitimate questions about speed and about how to strike the balance of imposing consequences against our adversaries for malicious cyber activity. We need to continue to have those discussions. But the guideposts, I would argue, need to be, one, making sure that we continue to be very clear we will impose consequences, and that means taking these steps, and then we can debate whether they're strong enough or soon enough, but we have to be willing to continue to impose consequences against these actors. And then getting into a discussion and continuing to have the debate about what consequences are going to strike the balance between deterrence and escalating to a point that is not going to be in our long-term national security interests. That's going to be a debate that's going to have to continue, but we first have to be very clear this activity will not stand and it will not go unresponded to, and there will not be a free pass for malicious cyber activity against our country.
All right, last question, because we are at the...
Thanks. Eric Gall. I'm with the Emergency Services Critical Sector. Do you perceive U.S. underinvestment in STEM, education and recruitment, as a security vulnerability to the U.S., given that we are so reliant on H-1B visa holders for our engineering, scientific, and computing sectors?
I think there needs to be, as I think this administration has shown, a lot more work in the STEM area, a much greater pipeline for those skills. What I would also say, and I'll return and give one more plug for both this group and for the new team to look at the report of the President's Commission on Cybersecurity, and that is the need for greater resources and focus on developing a cybersecurity workforce, certainly in the federal government, but across the board. That is another priority area. You asked me on the 3 things I would talk to the new team about in this regard. I don't know if I mentioned 2 or 3, but this would be either 3 or 4, which is a federal cybersecurity workforce and putting resources toward that, and a development pipeline. It's something that we made budget requests for that often went unanswered, but that's got to be a big point of focus for the next team.
Please join me in thanking the team that put this together, John Hogan and Garrett Graff, and also... And of course, I think you've gotten a sense today as to why Lisa is been a great public servant, a patriot, and been trusted by presidents of both parties over her long career in government. So please join me in thanking her.